Good morning, everyone. I'm Tim Cogshell, film critic with Film Week in Los Angeles, on LAist here in Los Angeles. I am a black man, a brownish black man with mostly gray hair and a white beard, and I'm sitting in front of a Trumbo poster and a hunger poster, a Argentine hunger poster, so it's called El Ansia, sitting behind me. And I'm here with the director of soundtrack to a coup d'etat, and Johan Grimonprez. Did I say it right, Johan?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, yeah, you did good.
Thank you so much. I appreciate
Oh,
your help with that. And we're here to talk about your absolutely extraordinary film. It's interesting. This morning, President Biden, the United States President Biden, actually spoke in front of the UN General Council this morning. Probably his last speech in front of the UN General Council, and of course, many other of the heads of state will be speaking in front of the UN General Council this morning as well. So the UN goes on. But on one extraordinary day in 1960, you capture a moment where the UN did not go on as usual. I want to talk about all of that history, but if you don't mind, first, I want to start with this question. My first question is about these Black artists, these Black jazz ambassadors, who during this period in history in the 1960s were sent out into the world to do something. Talk to me a little bit about what they thought that they were going out into the world to do, as opposed to what governments had in mind for them to be doing out in the world, which of course you speak to in your film.
of course, of course. Well, maybe I also maybe describe myself a little bit for the blind and the low vision impaired, because
Please.
yeah, that was part of the introduction. So I'm here in Brussels, and I'm in my kitchen, which is all over blue, with some sort of greens in the background, bamboo, and some antique furniture, which sort of would be sort of very much like myself, a bit of an antique figure. And I'm a white Belgian with maybe black stubbles on my beard, and yeah, drinking a bit of water and starting the conversation. So shall I repeat the question, because you were asking about the Black Jazz Ambassadors, but of
Yeah,
course.
yeah, those jazz ambassadors. What is it that they thought that they would be? What was their intention in
Right.
undertaking the program?
So what we have in the film is sort of we have the Black Jazz Ambassadors, but we also have like artists like Max Roach and Abby Lincoln, who were not sent out as jazz ambassadors, but very much like were part of the protest that happened at the Security Council in 1961 when Patrice Lumumba was murdered. And so music in the film is very much sort of part of that historical agency. There's the Black jazz musicians that protest. There's also the rumba artists. So we shouldn't forget that also there's a lot of rumba artists that accompanied Patrice Lumumba here to Brussels when he was released from prison two days later. The rumba artists actually composed the Independence Cha-Cha on the spot here in Brussels. So the music is not all is always very close to the historical sort of events. Now with the Black Jazz Ambassadors, what happened with, for example, with Louis Armstrong, but there's more. We had sort of Dizzy Gillespie who sent to Syria. We have Duke Ellington sent to Iraq. Louis Armstrong was sent to the Congo, and he was there twice, third week of October and third week of November. But what happens at the same time is that what I discovered is underneath, while the State Department would send out the Black Jazz Ambassador to whitewash sort of what was going on back home, Dizzy Gillespie would say, I didn't go over there to sugarcoat segregation back home. We could come back to that, because it's not that they were actually reduced to sort of passive instruments. They very much had also an agency in what their role they were playing. But to come back to sort of the context is that underneath, there was a coup d'etat being staged by the CIA. You had the two brothers, right? You had Allen Dulles and Foster Dulles. Foster Dulles was heading the State Department. Allen Dulles was chief of the CIA. And so it was like two hands on the tummy that actually were orchestrating foreign politics. One was staging coups. The other one was sending jazz musicians. But, what I discovered, and what was interesting, so while Louis Armstrong is in the Congo, the CIA is plotting to overthrow the first elected democratically elected premier in the newly independent Congo. And furthermore, like when he was there in October, November, Mobutu, who was sort of propped up by the CIA and the Belgians, the Belgian colonial or one could even say neo-colonial movement, was trying to install Mobutu to keep a hold of the mining industry, of course. And he was plotting to sort of, with the Belgians and the CIA, to kill Patrice Lumumba. Meantime, Louis Armstrong is there, who was not in the know about what was going on. And so it's not like with Louis Armstrong, what I thought was interesting, you know, he was not a passive instrument. Like he refused, for example, to go over to South Africa to play for an apartheid audience. He said, no, 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 I'm not going to play in South Africa. Or, for example, he would change his words. I think, was a bit more subtle, but he was changing his words from the song Black and Blue, where he was singing, I'm white inside. He changed the words to I'm right inside. It's very subtle, but it's so much more appropriate. And so he was there for almost a year, traveling in Africa, you know, doing a lot of countries. There's a famous picture where he's playing in front of the pyramid in Egypt as well. But when he got home in February, back in New York, he learned about the fact that Patrice Lumumba was murdered. And he heard about the protest at the Security Council where Abbie Lincoln and Max Roach were crashing, together actually with Amiri Baraka and Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was there as well. There's more musicians, but this was upon initiation by Abbie Lincoln with the Women's Rights Coalition in Harlem with Maya Angelou and Rosa Guy. And so when that protest happened, Louis Armstrong learned about it, and he threatened to sort of renounce his US citizenship and move to Ghana. So it's not that even when they're sent out as black jazz ambassadors, as a propaganda tool, still, they're not passive instruments. They're very much sort of like, in the way, even when Louis Armstrong even was there, you know, we have Trummy Trombone in the film. There's an interview with him, the trombonist of Louis Armstrong, when he was staying at Moshi Chombe at the time, who actually was complicit with sort of the overthrow and the murder of Lumumba. He was grilling Moshi Chombe, hey guy, you're in bed with big money, you better take care, you have to give and take, and give and take. And so even when he was lodged at Moshi Chombe, he actually was very critical. So yeah, it's a sort of a complex sort of schizophrenic situation.
If the undertaking had been what the musicians, the ambassadors had wanted it to be, what do you think the achievement would have been about things over abroad, or what the achievement have been about things here in the United States? In my heart, I think that maybe what they were trying to do is serve the United States such that the United States would have to be a better stewards of Black folks here in the United States.
Exactly. You know, when Louis Armstrong went over in 1956 to Ghana, you know, and it was the moment, it was just 1 year before Ghana would get independence and Kwame Nkrumah would be the first leader of the independent Ghana. He welcomed Louis Armstrong, and there was an audience of 100,000 people in Accra, in the sort of the main Polo Square. At the time was still called the Polo Square. And it was a huge mass of people in, you know, welcoming him when he stepped off the plane. So he took his trumpet out, and he was playing with 9 other trumpetists and trombonists on the airstrip itself. You know, but Nixon was there as well. At one point, Nixon sort of was talking to an African guy over there at the airport. And he said, oh, that must be wonderful to get independence. And the guy, sort of the black person, answered and said, well, I don't know. I live in the United States.
Very sharp indeed. The history of colonization in the Congo, the sabotage, the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, have been fodder for cinema before, a narrative cinema, as well as some documentaries. But your film is fresh, visually, orally. It's constructed like jazz. I'm a musician myself, and when I see your film, I see a jazz chart. I see a chart that has a beginning, and it has a place that it's going, and that it's going to come back to. But the stuff that happens in the middle, you just don't know. You just don't know what's going to happen in the middle. Talk a little bit about the construction of this film to tell the story and how it feels like jazz.
Well, yeah, the film is bookended. It starts with the drum solo of Max Roach, right? And it ends with the scream of Abbie Lincoln. So both like numbers from the We Insist Freedom Now album. That was actually in its integrity. We found that at the Belgian television. I'm not sure if that would have been broadcast in its entirety in the United States, but this was on public television in Belgium. That's where we got the footage. And I was surprised, But the flip side, right? You have that footage on Belgian television, 1964. The flip side is that a genocide is happening in the Congo. And that we did not know. Like, you have all the Belgians being fascinated by the concept, but underneath the empire of silence, called the l'Empire du Silence, is that a genocide was happening. And a genocide was happening also in 1960 already. And so the film takes that trajectory that, me as a Belgian, a good colonial, I'm joking, but as a Belgian, I never learned that story. It's a black page out of our own colonial history. It's a black page in the Belgian history, sort of what our country was sort of committing in the Congo. And for me, it's a story that still is sort of wiped under the carpet, right? We have Leopold II statues that are being blasted with red balloons, but I think we should go one step further, because the whole layout of Brussels is like avenues that laid out by Leopold II is built with rubber money. It's built with rubber money. It's sort of, again, something as a trauma that has never been talked about. It's changing, eh? There was a book, Ludo de Wette, who was an advisor to the film, who wrote the book, The Murder on Lumumba, set for the commission, and then the commission in 2000 sort of came to the conclusion, but never sort of really took full account of that murder, but said, yeah, Belgium was complicit and the monarchy was complicit as well. And so what we have in the trajectory of this film is sort of the way it's layered. You have the story of that independence movement, that sense of hope, also with all the non-aligned countries in the global south waking up, the independence movement, the waking up of the continent of Africa, that inspired the civil rights movement as well. Because that's another part, is that there's a go back and forth in that Pan-African movement that was sort of blooming very much in the beginning of the 60s, how that was smothered and how that was sort of in a neo-colonial grab, how Patrice Lumumba's killing was sort of the ground zero of how the West was about to deal with this sort of independence movement. And this is sort of the trajectory. But on top of that, you have all the layering of, for example, the United Nations. So we have the global south, right? So the September top of 1960, because the whole film, it starts with the drum solo of Max Roach, ends with the scream of Abbie Lincoln, but in the Security Council. That happens in the sort of United Nations. And the call with the drum in the beginning of the film is like, let's go our women, because this is the Harlem Writers Coalition, upon initiation by Abbie Lincoln, a musician, that's going to start that protest, that's going to crash the Security Council. And that call is set forth in the beginning of the film, and it leads up to that scream where they crash the Security Council. But in between, you have actually the General Assembly top, the summit of 1960 in September, which is the anniversary of the United Nations, is the 15th General Assembly, is where Nikita Khrushchev is calling out for all the world leaders to come talk at the General Assembly to talk about decolonization and demilitarization. And he will propose the decolonization resolution 1514 that will be accepted in December. But what I think is crucial, and it was called the Year of Africa. The United Nations was calling it the Year of Africa. Why? Because 16 African countries were admitted to the world body in that September top, including Congo. Now, what that admission of the 16, it was actually 17 countries. Cyprus was also part of that. But the admittance of all these sort of global south countries made that it was a political earthquake happening within the United Nations General Assembly. And that meant that the Afro-Asian bloc gained the majority votes within the United Nations. And that's a big shift. And so, of course, East and West, not saying that Nikita Khrushchev is not a saint, but both the United States and the Soviet Union were trying to play and get the global south on their side. And that's sort of what you see happening. It's quite interesting that there's sort of something that moves in the world. And the beginning of the film also shows the global south gathering in 1955 in Bandung, where Sukarno was inviting all world leaders from the global south to actually discuss the non-alignment movement and declare colonialism obsolete. And so,
yeah, and to declare their non-alignment very vocally, we are not aligned.
Exactly.
The pace of your film, the way it moves, and there's a narrator, but really the film almost narrates itself with the voices of the people from the moment. Talk a little bit about that construction. I cannot imagine the amount of footage that you had to go through, oral sound that you had to go through, and then all of those extraordinary quotes from State Department communiques, from the CIA communiques. Talk a little bit about gathering all of that together and figuring out how to use it.
Yeah, including the page numbers and the footnotes. Sometimes I joke about it. It's like an academic PDF in the format of a music clip. But yeah, the story is very layered, and it's done in dialogue with, I have to say that it's done in dialogue with, because I'm not like claiming that I can tell the story of Patrice Lumumba. I can tell the story how me as a Belgian digging into this background, what that did to me as sort of an exploration, and how we were actually involved in that as well, complicit with that. And so the film is done in dialogue with one, Nkoli Jean Bofana, who's a Congo-Belgian writer, who sets forth a thesis, and he calls it the algorithm Congo Inc., who sets forth that actually every mineral for every major war in 20th century, including even 21st century, moving into the war into space, is that every mineral was sourced from the Congo, but then it didn't benefit the Congo at all. This is his novel, like Congo Inc., and he reads from it. But then towards the end of the film, where we see an iPhone commercial and a Tesla commercial, that he's saying, you know, well, we have to tell our own story, but that story is still going on. It's still the same. It's genocide after genocide after genocide. So what the film puts in picture is sort of that inciting moment of what went wrong during that independence, and that what's still going on in East Congo with the rape of, like, the number at the end of the film is 80,000 plus women that Dennis Mukwege in Panzi hospital has treated. These are the amount of women that actually made it to the hospital. But that what was going on, what was set forth in the 1960s with that murder of Patrice Lumumba, and actually also King the Lumumba movement within the whole Congo, because 2/3 of the Lumumbists was rising up against this whole movement, against this neo-colonial grab, and that has never stopped, but that is still continuing. So that's in Collision Bofani. That's one trajectory that I thought was quite crucial. Then we have Yves Blouin, who actually gave the access to the memoirs of her mom, but also the home movies. And her mom is André Blouin. André Blouin is a controversial figure, but very interesting. She was the advisor and the chief of protocol and the speechwriter of Patrice Lumumba for the reign of 2.5 months that Patrice Lumumba was in power. But André Blouin is a very interesting character in the way that she was a stolen kid. Like a métis, a mixed race kid, was not allowed, right? So they were stolen and put in orphanages. She fled when she was 16, arrived in Guinea, got to know Sékou Touré, who was the first independent leader of the independent Guinea. Through Sékou Touré, where she also was advising him, she got to know Kwame Nkrumah. And then through Kwame Nkrumah, she got in touch and sort of was led as an advisor, and then was proposed to advise Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. Now, what's interesting with Sékou Touré and Kwame Nkrumah and Patrice Lumumba, they sort of were the start of that Pan-African movement to actually create the United States of Africa. And André Blouin was very much sort of part of that. She was very much inspired by Kwame Nkrumah and that move to make sort of the continent a whole free Africa and an United States of Africa. Anyway, this is the role of, this is the character of André Blouin, and her voice is being narrated by Marie Dawn. She's Zap Mama, who an important figure, rock star in the 90s here in Belgium. And she's the daughter of a Belgian father and a Congolese mother, and who had to flee during sort of the ensuing of what was going on after independence. And so the André Blouin story is a very interesting story.
The history of this period. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
I didn't understand the question. The history of...
I was going to ask you about the history. The history of this period has certainly faded away in the United States of America. It sounds like the history of this period has somewhat drifted away in Belgium, too. Is part of what your film intends to revive this history and connect it to the present day as we see things going on in things that look like colonialism, Russia and Ukraine, Israel and Gaza and Palestine. Is there any connective tissue between these events of then and
of course, 100%. You know, when you can add Yemen and Sudan, you know, you can add a whole number. Because what I felt was a crucial moment where, you know, there was that sense of hope and there was something happening in that General Assembly top where all were defending what was going on in the Congo. Because you have to know the overthrow happened 1 week before the General Assembly top. And so the big absentee, because Patrice Lumumba asked to defend his case at the United Nations, he was refused a visa and they didn't give him a plane ride. And he was democratically elected. He couldn't leave the country, didn't even got a visa by the US ambassador. And so he's the big absentee. But all those leaders are talking about the Congo. Even Nikita Khrushchev was so upset, he was actually moving, he was crossing the transatlantic with the boat, the Baltica, with the Eastern Bloc countries. And he changed his speech because he learned about the coup where the United Nations actually was also complicit. And he said, we're going to give it to Doc. And so he was, when he was slamming his shoe, because that was for me the start of the film, is actually the slamming of the shoe of Nikita Khrushchev, that I did not know that was because of my country. That was a surprise for myself. And he was slamming his shoe, demanding the resignation of Dag Hammarskjöld, the then Secretary General of the United Nations, because he actually, well, he had his back against the wall, and I have to give it to him. He was the first one to sort of install in the Suez crisis at the time, 1956 in Egypt, to install a peace corps, and he was arguing for that. And he was called the shuttle diplomat. He was actually sort of, in a sense, a very good diplomat. But something went wrong in the Congo, where he was with his back against the wall, where the United States was threatening and the United Kingdom were threatening to withdraw the money from the UN mission in the Congo. So he was sort of, and then he talked to Jawaharlal Nehru, who's also a part of that non-aligned movement, who was also present at the General Assembly top. He asked advice from Jawaharlal Nehru, and he said, yeah, we can actually appoint Dayal Rajaswar, who's an Indian diplomat. And sort of Hammarskjöld was changing course and taking the global south in, but he was navigating sort of a whole sort of world global situation that was reflecting the United Nations. And then he sort of, yeah, in a sense, did become complicit in sort of overthrowing, in the overthrow, because they refused to give Patrice Lumumba actually a forum on the national radio of his own sort of country. And they actually blocked the airport. They blocked the airport, so he couldn't like have help from Stanleyville, where he sort of had a big Kisangani, is now called, help. I lost a bit of thread because you asked about. Yeah, I thought was that actually was set in motion then at that time has not changed. The neo-colonial grab is still going on, and it was conquer and divide. But actually, at the time, it was not like that. Malcolm X, at the time, he was threatening to drag the United States in front of the United Nations and have specifically the African countries and the Afro-Asian bloc on his case to actually sue the United States for not giving civil rights to the African community. There's 22 million African Americans that didn't have actually voting rights. They did not have any rights. So he said, this is not sort of, it's what he says in the film itself, is that it's sort of, it's not a sort of a local problem, it's a human rights problem. And so there was that sense, because for Malcolm X also, his daughter is called Lumumba, right? One of his daughters was called Lumumba. And I was also surprised to actually listening to a lot of the speeches that actually the way he was so accurate in naming what was going on, which we did not have actually on national television here. It was like, oh, we have to save the white hostages. But when Malcolm X says, well, why do you call them white hostages? Does that mean that black lives are less important? And so listening to the Malcolm X speech in retrospect, it totally made sense. It totally made sense.
Yeah. It's all very circular, isn't it? We have to close up. I do want to ask one more question, a filmmaking sort of question. You have this extraordinary content, these elements in this film, historical footage, newsreel footage. I mean, archives from the UN, photographs, home movies, and then all of this music. What drove the film, the shape of the film? Was it the elements that drove the shape of the film, or did you have a shape of the film in mind and you found the elements which suited that shape?
Well, of course, for me, it's like I made a film, Shadow World, which was on the corruption of the global arms trade. And then you know, a big part, of course, that corruption is sort of the United States reeling and dealing in total what actually the rest of the world is reels and deals in defense industry. You should not call it defense industry, but war industry. And Belgium was sort of absent. We have NATO, which is synonym to Lockheed, but you know what I felt was absent in the way I wanted to tell the story is where was Belgium fitting in all this? And then digging back into the past and sort of never learning that history in my school when I grew up was for me so crucial. But when it comes to the filmmaking and other archives, I thought it was interesting sort of, you know, digging and listening very carefully. You know, music had such an important agency to play in that history. And then I could not but include that. And the fact that music is sort of stepping onto that political stage, vice versa, I felt like, well, why don't we give sort of the politicians or like the UN, for example, the Suez UN vote, make that as lyrics to the jazz compositions. And so there's something going back and forth to what that agency holds in petto for that whole story at that time. And for me, I could not but include that Scream by Abbey Lincoln. If you sort of go through that whole history, I could not but include that. But also it's like it's like digging through the archives, the history of that moment, the Congolese archives here in the Belgian televisions, who's a partner in the film, stumbling onto, for example, John Coltrane. You know, the My Favorite Things. That was again, it's a concert that was completely recorded and is in the archives of the Belgian television, including Alabama. And knowing Alabama goes back to the bombing in Birmingham. And then that lends itself so well to sort of what was going on when Malcolm X is talking about the bombing in the Quito province. And so it could not but sort of like connect those things in a way. But why, you know, in the Belgian archives, we have all these documents, but what's the meaning of that? And that's the flip side. For me, it was the flip side to go dig much deeper of like, what did that all mean, right? What did that all mean as a filmmaker? And of course, yeah.
Well, it's a fascinating history. That scream of Abbey Lincoln still echoes. I hope that they can hear it today in the UN as the General Assembly meets yet again. Johan, it's an extraordinary film, soundtrack to a coup d'état. Thank you so much. And I have to tell you, I'll be touting it all season. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. All right. Thank you for the interview and the dialogue.
I appreciate it so much.